Hello my dear wanderers of the twilight paths. Welcome back to our cozy sanctuary where ancient stories breathe life into the shadows and the old magic still whispers through the autumn mist. Tonight, I invite you to settle deep into your most comfortable space, perhaps with a warm cup of tea cradled between your hands, as we journey together into one of Ireland's most mysterious and captivating legends. We're going to explore a creature that has haunted the lonely roads and wild hillsides of Ireland for centuries, a being that embodies the very essence of the unpredictable Celtic otherworld. Tonight, we delve into the world of the Púca, that magnificent shapeshifter whose name alone once sent shivers down the spines of travelers making their way home through the gathering dusk. Picture yourself walking along a narrow country lane in Ireland, the October wind carrying the scent of rain and rotting leaves, when suddenly you encounter a magnificent black horse with eyes that glow like molten gold in the darkness. Or perhaps a stranger in fine clothes who speaks to you with unsettling familiarity about secrets you've never told. These are the faces of the Púca, a creature that has captivated Irish imagination for over 1,000 years, dwelling in that liminal space between helper and hinderer, between blessing and curse, between this world and the next. The very name Púca carries within it centuries of mystery and power. When you say the word aloud, pronounced P-O-K-A, you're speaking an ancient piece of the Irish language that has echoed through generations of storytellers gathered around peat fires on cold winter nights. The word itself translates most simply as spirit or ghost, though such a translation barely scratches the surface of what this creature truly represents. The true origin of the word remains a matter of scholarly debate. Some researchers propose a connection to the Old Irish poc, meaning male goat, which would align with one of the forms this shapeshifter commonly assumes. Other linguists suggest possible links to Old Norse words like Púki, meaning a mischievous demon or nature spirit. If this Norse connection holds, it could reflect cultural exchanges between Viking settlers and the Celtic peoples of Ireland during the medieval period. What seems clear from place name evidence is that the word has been in use since at least the 8th century, making it genuinely ancient. But the Púca is known by many names across the Celtic lands, each variation carrying its own subtle flavor of meaning. In various parts of Ireland, you might hear it called Púca, Phouka, Phouka, Púca, or Púca. Cross the Irish Sea into Wales, and the creature becomes the PW. Journey to Cornwall, and you'll hear whispers of the Bucca. Even in the Channel Islands, between England and France, locals once spoke in hushed tones of the Pook, fairy creatures said to dwell near ancient standing stones. This widespread recognition across Celtic territories speaks to how deeply embedded this shapeshifter is in the cultural consciousness of these lands, suggesting that the belief in such spirits dates back to times when the Druids still walked the sacred groves and the old gods held sway over hill and valley. What sets the Púca apart from many other creatures in Irish folklore is its fundamental ambiguity, its refusal to be neatly categorized as wholly good or wholly evil. This is not a simple monster to be feared and avoided, nor is it a benevolent fairy to be courted with offerings. Instead, the Púca embodies something more complex and more true to the nature of the wild world itself. Like the seasons that can bring both nourishing rain and devastating storm, like the forest that provides both shelter and danger, the Púca represents the duality inherent in nature and in life itself. One night it might save a lost child from wandering into a bog. The next, it might give a drunken farmer the wildest, most terrifying ride of his life. This unpredictability makes the Púca one of the most psychologically sophisticated creatures in Celtic mythology, a being that reflects the fundamental truth that life itself is neither entirely safe nor entirely dangerous, but something far more nuanced. The earliest written references to the Púca date back to medieval Irish manuscripts. Though given the nature of oral tradition, the beliefs surrounding this creature likely extend much further back in time. What makes the folklore particularly fascinating is how consistent certain elements remain across different regions and time periods, even as other details shift and change. Wherever the Púca appears in Irish tradition, certain truths remain constant. This is a creature of the night, rarely if ever seen in the full light of day. It is a shapeshifter par excellence, able to transform its appearance at will. It possesses the power of human speech, often using this gift to confuse, advise, or prophesy. And most importantly, it is inextricably connected to the rhythms of the agricultural year, particularly to that liminal time when summer dies and winter is born, when the harvest has been brought in and the fields lie empty under the cold November sky. To understand the Púca is to understand something essential about how the Irish people have traditionally viewed the relationship between humanity and the natural world. In modern times, we often think of nature as something separate from ourselves, something to be controlled or conquered or preserved. But in the worldview that gave birth to the Púca legend, humans and nature existed in a constant, dynamic relationship, a dance of give and take where the natural world was alive with spirits and intelligences that demanded respect, appeasement, and careful negotiation. The Púca represents the wild, untamed aspect of the landscape, the part that cannot be fully controlled or predicted, the reminder that no matter how carefully you tend your fields or plan your journey, there are forces beyond your mastery that can disrupt your expectations at any moment. This shapeshifter is said to make its home in Ireland's most remote and atmospheric locations. Picture the lonely mountainsides where mist clings to the heather and the wind carries strange sounds. Imagine the desolate bogs where the ground becomes treacherous and solid earth gives way without warning to sucking mud. Think of the deep, dark pools at the base of waterfalls, where the water churns white and the spray creates rainbows in the afternoon light. These are the domains of the Púca, places where the boundary between the ordinary world and the otherworld grows thin, where a traveler might step from the mundane into the magical without even realizing they've crossed a threshold. The creature's connection to water is particularly significant. Throughout Ireland, you'll find numerous small mountain lakes, springs, and pools known as Púca pools or Phouka, which translates to the Púca's hole or demon hole. Some of these waters lie at the sources of Ireland's major rivers. The River Liffey, which flows through the heart of Dublin City, has its origins in the Wicklow Mountains, where it tumbles over rocks creating a waterfall that locals have long called Phouka. Similarly, the River Bann, the longest river in Northern Ireland, is associated with Púca pools in its upper reaches. During the Christianization of Ireland, when missionaries sought to overlay pagan beliefs with Christian symbolism, many of these Púca pools were renamed as St. Patrick's Wells, but the older names and the older beliefs persisted in the memories of the people who lived near these waters. These associations with water sources are deeply meaningful. In Celtic belief, water was always a gateway to the otherworld, a place where offerings were made and where spirits dwelled. Springs and wells were considered sacred long before Christianity arrived in Ireland. The fact that the Púca claimed these liminal water spaces as its territory reinforces its role as a creature that exists between worlds, neither fully of the mortal realm nor entirely of the fairy realm, but something that moves between them with fluid grace. Now, let us turn our attention to the forms this magnificent shapeshifter can assume. For it is in the Púca's various guises that we see the full range of its power and the breadth of its influence over the Irish imagination. The most famous and most frequently reported form of the Púca is that of a horse. But this is no ordinary horse. This is a creature of midnight black, with a coat that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it, sleek and muscular and radiating barely contained power. Its manner flows wild and untamed, sometimes described as being impossibly long or moving in winds that don't touch anything else. But it is the eyes that truly mark this creature as something other than a natural horse. Those eyes glow with an inner fire, sometimes described as golden, sometimes as red, luminescent orbs that pierce the darkness and seem to see into the very soul of anyone who meets their gaze. When you see those eyes burning in the night, you know you're in the presence of something that transcends the natural order. This black horse form is not merely the most common manifestation of the Púka. It is also the most dangerous in terms of the creature's favorite trick. The Púka horse has a particular fondness for appearing along lonely roads after dark, especially to travelers making their way home from the local pub. There's something almost playfully malicious in how it presents itself. A magnificent steed, seemingly without rider or owner, standing perfectly still beside the road as if waiting for someone to mount it. To anyone who's had a few drinks and is facing a long walk home in the cold and dark, the temptation is nearly irresistible. Here is a beautiful horse that seems to be offering a ride. What harm could there be in climbing on its back? Oh, but this is where the Púka's trick begins in earnest. The moment an unsuspecting traveler settles onto the Púka's back, the creature springs into motion. But this is unlike any ride the person has ever experienced. The Púka takes off at breakneck speed, galloping across countryside with impossible velocity, leaping over obstacles that no normal horse could clear, racing through terrain that would kill an ordinary animal. It might carry its rider through bramble patches that tear at clothes and skin. It might splash through icy streams and ford rivers at their deepest points. It might scale steep hillsides or race along cliff edges where one misstep would mean certain death. The accounts of these wild rides are remarkably consistent across different regions and time periods. The rider, whether drunk or sober when they first mounted, finds themselves unable to dismount, as if some invisible force keeps them glued to the Púka's back. They might scream for help, but the creature only moves faster. They might pray to the saints, but the Púka seems immune to holy invocations. For hours these terrifying rides continue, through the darkest parts of the night, until finally, as dawn approaches, the Púka slows, stops, and deposits its thoroughly traumatized passenger back at the exact spot where they first encountered the creature. The rider stumbles away, muddy and scratched and exhausted, with confused memories of the night's events and a new respect for the dangers that lurk along country roads after dark. What's particularly interesting about these accounts is that, despite the terror of the experience, the Púka rarely actually harms its riders physically. Unlike the Kelpie of Scottish folklore, which drowns its victims in rivers and devours them, or the each-use that tears its riders to pieces, the Púka seems content with simply terrifying people. The worst injuries reported are typically scrapes and bruises from branches, exhaustion from the wild ride, and perhaps a lingering sense of unease or a nagging feeling that the world is stranger and more dangerous than one had previously believed. Some accounts suggest that people who have been taken on these rides are forever changed, marked in some subtle way by their encounter with the otherworld, more sensitive to the presence of spirits or more cautious about walking alone at night. But the horse is far from the Púka's only form. In different parts of Ireland, and in different circumstances, this shapeshifter might manifest in a variety of other guises, each with its own particular character and significance. In some regions, particularly in County Roscommon, the Púka often appears as a black goat. This form connects back to that possible etymological root of Pok, meaning male goat. The goat Púka is typically described as having curling horns and the same distinctive glowing eyes that mark the horse form. The appearance of a goat-shaped Púka could be particularly unsettling to farmers, as goats were common farm animals, and seeing one that moved with unnatural intelligence or appeared in impossible places would be deeply disturbing. The goat form also carries darker associations in Christian-influenced folklore, where goats became linked with devils and demons, adding an extra layer of menace to this particular manifestation. The Púka can also take the form of a large black dog, similar to other spectral hounds that appear in Celtic and English folklore. The dog form allows the creature to follow travelers more subtly than a horse, trotting alongside them on dark roads, sometimes invisible except for the sound of its panting or the padding of its paws on the ground. In some accounts, the Púca dog might attempt to herd people away from dangerous locations or toward places of safety, acting more as a guardian than a tormentor. Rabbits and hares are another favored form, particularly appropriate given the hare's long association with magic and transformation in Celtic belief. A Púca hare might dash across someone's path, leading them astray if they try to follow it, or it might appear in impossible places, sitting calmly on a rooftop or perched on a narrow ledge where no natural rabbit could balance. In County Waterford and County Wexford, local tradition held that the Púca often appeared as an enormous eagle with a wingspan that seemed impossibly large, soaring overhead on wings that made no sound. This aerial form gave the creature a different kind of power, the ability to watch from above, to swoop down unexpectedly, and to symbolize a perspective beyond normal human understanding. The eagle Púca could see everything, know everything, and its appearance overhead might presage significant events or changes in fortune. Perhaps most unsettling of all are the occasions when the Púca takes human form. These manifestations are rarely entirely convincing, however, at least according to the traditional accounts. The creature might appear as a man or woman dressed in fine clothes, but there will always be something slightly off about the appearance. Perhaps the figure has animal ears poking through their hair, or a tail hidden beneath a long coat. Maybe their eyes still glow with that telltale golden or red light. Or perhaps it's something more subtle, an uncanniness in their movements, a wrongness in the way they speak or stand. In some stories, the Púca appears as an old man with a walking stick, approaching travelers on the road and engaging them in conversation that starts normally enough but gradually becomes strange and unsettling. In other accounts, it might take the form of a beautiful woman to lure young men into following it into dangerous territory. What's particularly clever about the human form Púca is that it often speaks to people with uncanny knowledge of their personal affairs. It might greet someone by name even though they've never met. It might reference family secrets or private shames that no stranger could possibly know. It might predict future events with disturbing accuracy. This ability to know the unknowable, to speak truths that should be hidden, reinforces the Púca's connection to the other world, suggesting that from its supernatural perspective, the boundaries and secrets that humans maintain become transparent and meaningless. In County Down, local tradition portrayed the Púca in yet another form, as a short, disfigured goblin-like creature that appeared at harvest time to demand its share of the crops. This manifestation emphasizes the Púca's role in the agricultural cycle and its expectation of proper respect and offering from the human community. Meanwhile, in County Lowis, the Púca took on a particularly terrifying aspect, described as a huge, monstrous bogeyman that inspired genuine dread in those who claimed to have encountered it. These regional variations suggest that different communities projected their own particular fears and concerns onto this shape-shifting figure, molding the Púca legend to reflect local anxieties and values. But regardless of which form it takes, certain features remain remarkably consistent across accounts. The Púca's fur or hair is almost always described as black, that deep, light-absorbing black that seems to belong more to night itself than to any natural animal. And those eyes, those strange, luminous eyes, appear in almost every description, glowing gold or red or sometimes an eerie green, windows into something ancient and inhuman and powerful beyond mortal understanding. Now, having explored the many faces the Púca can wear, we must grapple with a more difficult question. What is the true nature of this creature? Is it a malevolent spirit to be feared and avoided? Or is it perhaps a misunderstood guardian that deserves respect and even gratitude? The answer, as is so often the case with Irish folklore, is deliciously complicated. The Púca occupies a unique space in the hierarchy of Irish supernatural beings. It is not a straightforward monster like some creatures of legend. It cannot be dismissed as purely evil or purely good. Instead, It exists in a state of moral ambiguity that makes it far more interesting and far more true to the complexity of the natural world it represents. On one hand, we have the countless stories of the Púca's mischief and the genuine terror it can inspire. Those wild midnight rides on the black horse form are described in terms that make clear how frightening they are to experience. Imagine being carried through the night at impossible speeds, unable to control your direction or dismount, not knowing if the creature bearing you will tire and stop or will eventually dash you against rocks or throw you into a ravine. The psychological torture of that experience, even if it ends with you safely deposited back where you started, would be profound. Then there are the accounts of the Púca's spite and vindictiveness. In some stories, if a person refused to mount the Púca when invited, or if they somehow insulted or offended the creature, it would take revenge on their property. Fences would be torn down in the night. Livestock would be scattered across the countryside. Valuable equipment would be damaged or destroyed. The Púca would call out the person's name from outside their house, demanding they come out, and woe betide them if they ignored the summons. This aspect of the Púca folklore served a practical social function, providing a supernatural explanation for vandalism and accidents while also reinforcing certain behavioral norms about how to conduct oneself at night and how to treat the land and its spirits with proper respect. The creature's tendency to befoul food also inspired considerable wariness. Children were warned never to eat blackberries after the 1st of November, because by then the Púca had supposedly spit on them or worse, rendering them poisonous. Any crops left in the fields after Samhain were considered Púca or ferro-blasted, tainted by the creature's touch and unfit for human consumption. This tradition had the practical effect of ensuring that harvests were completed in a timely manner and that farmers didn't leave valuable crops to rot in the fields, but it also reinforced the idea that the Púca was something to be wary of, something that could spoil and ruin through mere contact. There's also a darker strain in some Púca tales that portrays the creature as actively malicious or even murderous. A few accounts describe Púca as bloodthirsty beings that hunted humans, or that would lead travelers into bogs where they would drown, or that would carry people to the edges of cliffs and shake them off. These darker tales may represent later embellishments or may come from particularly hostile encounters, but they speak to the genuine fear that the Púca could inspire in rural communities where the night was full of very real dangers, and where getting lost in the wrong terrain could easily mean death from exposure or accident. But set against all these frightening aspects are an equally compelling set of stories that portray the Púca in a very different light. These are the tales that reveal the creature's capacity for kindness, its protective instincts, and its sometimes surprising sense of fairness. Consider the stories where the Púca appears to warn people of danger. In some accounts, it manifests to turn travelers away from unsafe paths, to prevent them from walking into bogs or crossing bridges that are about to collapse. There are tales of Púca appearing before fatal accidents, their presence serving as a supernatural alarm that saves lives. In these moments, the creature acts not as a tormentor but as a guardian, using its otherworldly knowledge to protect the very humans it is usually accused of tormenting. Then there are the remarkable stories of Púca that helped humans with their work. The Irish poet Lady Wilde, mother of Oscar Wilde and a dedicated folklorist who collected many traditional tales, recorded several accounts of helpful Púca. In one famous story, a farmer's son named Padraig encountered a Púca that appeared as a young bull and promised to help mill corn at an old mill. True to its word, the Púca and its supernatural companions would arrive each night and work tirelessly, grinding corn into flour while Padraig watched from hiding. The family grew prosperous from this arrangement. Eventually, Padraig made the Púca a gift of a fine silk suit as a token of gratitude, which so pleased the creature that it decided to see more of the world and stopped its nightly work. But by then the family had accumulated enough wealth to retire comfortably. This story is particularly interesting because it shows a Púca that keeps its promises, that can be negotiated with, and that responds positively to gifts and gratitude. It suggests that the key to positive relationships with Pooka lies in treating them with respect, acknowledging their power, and showing appropriate appreciation for any help they provide. The tale also contains that wonderful detail of the Púca being pleased with fine clothing, reminding us that despite its supernatural nature, it shares certain very human vanities and desires. In some regional traditions, particularly in mountainous areas, the Púca was spoken of with considerable more respect than fear. People in these regions believed that if you treated the Púca with proper deference and made appropriate offerings, it could be positively beneficial. There are accounts of Púca that regularly appeared on hilltops on the 1st of November, speaking to those who consulted them and providing intelligent answers to questions about what the coming year would bring. These prophesying Púca acted almost like oracles, dispensing wisdom and warnings to those brave or foolish enough to seek them out. Another fascinating aspect of the helpful Púca appears in stories where the creature actively intervenes to protect humans from other, more malevolent supernatural beings. In these tales, a person might be walking at night when a Púca appears and warns them that they are about to encounter something far more dangerous, a truly evil fairy or spirit that means them genuine harm. The Púca might then guide them to safety, shepherd them away from the danger, or even stand between them and the threat. What makes these stories particularly intriguing is that the Púca often identifies itself in these situations, telling the bewildered human exactly what it is. This willingness to reveal its true nature is highly unusual in fairy folklore, where most supernatural beings guard their names and identities jealously. It suggests that the Púca, despite its reputation for trickery, operates under some kind of moral code that includes protecting those who deserve protection. So how do we reconcile these contradictory aspects of the Púca's nature? One way to understand it is that the creature represents something fundamental about existence itself. Life is not neatly divided into good and evil. The natural world that the Púca embodies is neither cruel nor kind in any absolute sense. A storm can destroy your home or water your crops depending on its timing and severity. A forest can shelter you from enemies or harbor predators. The same fire that warms your hearth can burn down your house. The Púca, in its unpredictability, reflects this fundamental truth. Based on the patterns in the folklore, it seems the creature is not guided by malice or benevolence in any absolute sense, but rather by its own nature, its own mood, its own mysterious purposes. Treat it with respect, leave it appropriate offerings, acknowledge its power and its place in the order of things, and you might find it helpful or at least neutral. Disrespect it, ignore traditional observances, behave badly, and you might find yourself on the receiving end of its less pleasant attentions. The Púca, in other words, serves as a kind of supernatural enforcement of proper behavior and proper respect for the old ways and the old powers. There's also the question of who receives the Púca's negative attention. Many accounts specify that the creature particularly targets drunkards and those with evil intentions. The wild rides are often given to men who've spent the evening in the pub and are staggering home. The Púca's mischief often affects those who have been careless, disrespectful, or cruel. This suggests that, at least in some interpretations, the Púca acts as a kind of rough justice, punishing those who deserve punishment or teaching lessons to those who need to learn them. The ambiguity of the Púca's nature also serves an important psychological and social function. In a world where life was genuinely dangerous, where accidents happened frequently, where crops could fail and people could die from causes that seemed random and inexplicable, the Púca provided a framework for understanding misfortune. If something bad happened to you, maybe it was because you defended the Púca. If you survived a close call, maybe the Púca had been watching over you. This kind of magical thinking helped people feel like the world had some kind of order to it, that there were rules governing fortune and misfortune, even if those rules were mysterious and the beings enforcing them were capricious. The regional variations in how the Púca manifests and behaves paint a fascinating picture of how folklore adapts to local contexts and concerns. Ireland, despite being a relatively small island, has always been a land of distinct regional identities, and these differences are reflected beautifully in the varying portrayals of the Púca across different counties and provinces. As we've mentioned, in County Down, the Púca appears as a short, disfigured goblin demanding a share of the harvest. This manifestation emphasizes the agricultural aspects of the legend and the importance of leaving offerings. The description as disfigured adds an element of physical grotesqueness that makes the encounter more unsettling, but the creature's demands are straightforward. Give it its due portion of the crops, and all will be well. This form of the Púca serves as a clear reminder that the spirits of the land have rights and expectations that must be honored. In County Lowis, the transformation is dramatic. Here, the Púca is described as a monstrous, hairy bogeyman, a thing of genuine terror that haunts the night and frightens all who encounter it. The emphasis on fear and monstrousness suggests that in this region, the Púca legend was used primarily as a cautionary tale to keep people, especially children, from wandering about after dark. The creature becomes almost entirely threatening, with little of the ambiguity present in other regional versions. The County Waterford and County Wexford tradition of the Púca as a giant eagle is particularly striking because it removes the creature from the ground-level interactions typical of most accounts. An eagle Púca exists in a different relationship with humans, watching from above, capable of diving down at any moment but also more distant, more removed. The enormous wingspan described in these accounts creates an image of something almost mythological, like the great birds of legend that carried off heroes or served as messengers of the gods. This aerial form also suggests a broader perspective, a creature that can see the patterns and connections that ground-dwelling humans miss. In County Roscommon, where the Púca manifests as a black goat with curling horns, the connection to older, pre-Christian beliefs becomes particularly evident. Goats have long been associated with the wild places, with untamed nature, and in Christian symbolism they became linked with the demonic. A Púca in goat form would carry all these associations, representing both the wildness of the natural world and, to Christian-influenced minds, a hint of something diabolical and pagan. Beyond these major regional variations, there are countless local differences in belief and practice surrounding the Púca. In some areas, people believed that the creature could be deterred by wearing sharp spurs if you encountered it in horse form. The idea was that if the Púca tried to take you on a wild ride, the spurs would give you a means of control or at least a way to convince the creature to let you go. There's a wonderful story, preserved by the folklorist Sean O'Croinin, about a young boy who was targeted by a Púca multiple times. After his first terrifying ride, his employer gave him spurs to wear. When the Púca appeared again and invited the boy to mount, the boy agreed, and the moment the creature felt the spurs, it threw him off and galloped away. In later encounters, the Púca would actually ask whether the boy had his sharp things on before approaching, showing a healthy respect for cold iron and its power over supernatural beings. In some regions, particularly in southern County Fermanagh, there was a tradition of gathering on certain hilltops on specific days to await the appearance of a speaking horse, which was understood to be a Púca. This practice, which persisted in some areas into relatively recent times, transformed the Púca from something to be feared into something like an oracle, a source of wisdom and prophecy that could be consulted if one was brave enough to seek it out. The practices around leaving benches by doorways show yet another regional variation in how people attempted to interact with Púca. In some areas, it was traditional to place a comfortable bench on the right side of your front door, and either an uncomfortable bench or a rockery on the left side. The belief was that a good-natured Púca would always sit on the right, while a more mischievous or malevolent one would favor the left. By making the right side inviting and the left side uninviting, You could subtly encourage any Pootsai that visited your home to be well disposed toward you and your family. This practice shows a kind of practical magic, an attempt to shape supernatural behavior through physical arrangements in the human world. These regional variations reveal how folklore functions as a living tradition, constantly adapting to local needs, values, and experiences. The Púca in each region becomes, in some sense, a reflection of that particular community's relationship with the unknown, with the natural world, and with the supernatural. A farming community worried about harvests emphasizes the Púca's connection to crops and offerings. A mountainous region with lots of dangerous terrain might emphasize the protective aspects, the warnings given to travelers. An area with strong Christian influence might darken the legend, adding more demonic aspects. Each community shaped the Púca into something meaningful for their specific context. Yet through all these variations, certain core elements remain consistent. The shape-shifting ability, the connection to wild and lonely places, the power of human speech, the association with night and darkness, and that fundamental ambiguity of character. It's this combination of regional specificity and core consistency that has allowed the Púca legend to survive and thrive for so many centuries. Of all the traditions and associations surrounding the Púca, none is stronger or more significant than its connection to Samhain, that ancient Celtic festival that marks the end of summer and the beginning of winter, the death of the growing season and the start of the dark half of the year. To understand the Púca fully, we must understand its role in this most important time of the Celtic calendar. Samhain, pronounced Sown, falls on the 31st of October and extends into the 1st of November, corresponding in the modern calendar to Halloween and All Saints' Day. But to call Samhain simply the origin of Halloween would be to vastly undersell its significance in the Celtic worldview. Samhain was one of the 4 great fire festivals that marked the turning of the seasons, along with Imbolc in February, Beltane in May, and Lughnasadh in August. Of these 4, Samhain and Beltane were considered the most significant, marking as they did the 2 great transitions of the year, from the light half to the dark half, and from the dark half back to the light. Samhain was, above all, a time of endings and beginnings. It marked the official end of the harvest season. By Samhain, all crops should have been brought in from the fields, stored safely away against the coming winter. The cattle would be driven down from their summer pastures in the mountains to the protection of the lower valleys. Some animals would be slaughtered, their meat preserved to feed the household through the lean months ahead. It was a time of transition from abundance to scarcity, from the easy living of summer to the hard survival of winter. But Samhain was also a time of profound spiritual significance. The Celts believed that during Samhain, the veil between the world of the living and the world of the dead grew thin. The boundaries that normally kept the mortal realm separate from the other world became permeable. Spirits could cross over. The dead could return to visit their living families. And the fairy folk, the Aos Sai, were particularly active and particularly dangerous during this liminal time. It is precisely during this festival, when the barriers between worlds dissolve, that the Púca comes most fully into its power. Samhain is the Púca's time, when it roams most freely and when encounters with it are most likely. This association makes perfect sense when you consider what the Púca represents. It is itself a liminal being, existing between worlds, between animal and human, between helpful and harmful. During Samhain, when all boundaries become fluid, the Púca is in its element. The agricultural traditions surrounding the Púca at Samhain are particularly rich and revealing. Chief among these is the practice of leaving what's called the Púca's share of the harvest. This was typically the last sheaf of grain cut from the field, or a portion of the vegetables, or some other token amount of the crop. Rather than gathering every last stalk and root, farmers would deliberately leave this offering in the field for the Púca. The reasons for this practice operated on multiple levels. On a practical level, Leaving the Púca's share ensured that the harvest was completed before Samhain. You couldn't leave offerings for the Púca if you hadn't finished bringing in your crops, so the tradition encouraged timely completion of this crucial work. On a spiritual level, it represented an acknowledgement that the land and its bounty were not entirely under human control. By leaving a portion of the harvest, you were recognizing the Púca's claim on the wild spaces, honoring the supernatural forces that influenced fertility and growth. It was an act of respect and appeasement, a way of saying, I understand that this land is not entirely mine, and I share its fruits with the spirits that dwell here. If you failed to leave the Púca's share, or if you tried to harvest every last bit of your crop without acknowledging the spirit's claim, you risked the Púca's displeasure. It might trample your fields, scatter your livestock, damage your equipment, or worse. But if you left the proper offering, you might find that the Púca blessed your fields, ensuring good crops in the coming year. The creature might even protect your property from other, more malevolent spirits. This reciprocal relationship, this understanding that humans and supernatural beings exist in a web of mutual obligations, is fundamental to Celtic spiritual practice. The tradition extended beyond simply leaving crops in the field. In some areas, farmers would take portions of their harvest and leave them in specific locations known to be favored by the Púca, near rocky outcrops, by springs or pools, at crossroads, or on hilltops. These offerings might include not just grain but also milk, bread, or even specially prepared foods. The quality of the offering mattered. Giving the Púca spoiled or inferior goods would be worse than giving nothing at all, as it would constitute an insult rather than a genuine show of respect. The association between the Púca and November 1st is so strong that this day became known in many parts of Ireland as Púca Day or Púca's Day. This is supposedly the one day of the year when the Púca can be counted on to behave in a civil, benevolent manner. On this day, it was believed that the Púca would emerge from its usual haunts and could be approached for advice or prophecy. Brave souls would climb specific hills or mountains on Púca Day, waiting for the creature to appear and answer questions about what the coming year would hold. The Púca was said to speak intelligently on this day, giving proper and useful answers to those who consulted it, unlike its usual habit of speaking in riddles and half-truths designed to confuse. This annual day of cooperation represents a kind of truce between the human and supernatural worlds, a recognition that both sides benefit from occasional direct communication and mutual understanding. It also suggests that the Púca's usual mischief and terror might be, in some sense, a test or a game, and that once a year it's willing to set aside the tricks and deal with humans directly and honestly. The tradition regarding blackberries and other wild fruits perfectly illustrates the Púca's role in the seasonal cycle. In Ireland, blackberries ripen in late summer and early autumn, and they were traditionally gathered as a free source of food and a welcome addition to the diet. But everyone knew that you should never eat blackberries after Samhain, after the 1st of November. The reason given in folklore was that the Púca had either spit on them, urinated on them, or defecated on them after this date, rendering them poisonous or at least extremely unpleasant to consume. From a practical standpoint, this belief served a useful purpose. Blackberries that remain on the brambles after the first frost often do begin to deteriorate, becoming mushy and potentially harboring mold or bacteria that could cause illness. The belief about the Púca contaminating the berries was a memorable way of encoding this practical wisdom, ensuring that people wouldn't consume overripe fruit that might make them ill. But it also reinforced the idea that after Samhain, after the proper harvest season had ended, the wild places and their fruits belonged entirely to the supernatural realm. Humans had their time to gather. Afterward, the Púca claimed what remained. The same principle applied to any crops left in the fields after Samhain. Anything still growing or lying on the ground after that date was considered Púca or ferroblasted, touched by the otherworld and therefore unsuitable for human consumption. This might seem wasteful from a modern perspective, but it served multiple functions. It ensured that people completed their harvests in a timely fashion, stored food properly before winter arrived, and didn't become lazy or careless about the crucial work of providing for the cold months. It also maintained the symbolic boundary between human and supernatural realms, acknowledging that there are times and spaces that belong to the spirits. The connection between the Púca and Samhain also manifests in the timing of its most active periods. While the creature can appear at any time of year, encounters with it become far more common as Samhain approaches and in the weeks immediately following. The autumn months, from late September through November, are peak Púca season. This is when the creature is most likely to take travelers on wild rides, to appear speaking prophecy, to demand its share of crops, or to cause mischief. As winter deepens, Púca sightings tend to decline, as if the creature retreats to wherever it dwells during the quieter months, emerging again as the wheel of the year turns toward the next transition. Weather folklore also connected the Púca to Samhain and autumn. In many regions, if rain fell while the sun was shining, creating that peculiar atmospheric condition the Irish call the devil's beating his wife, it was said that the Púca would definitely make an appearance that night. This belief tied the creature to those liminal weather conditions, those moments when nature seems to violate its own rules, just as the Púca itself exists in violation of normal categories and boundaries. Among all the tales told about the Púca throughout the centuries, none has captured the Irish imagination quite like the story of Brian Boru and his legendary encounter with this shapeshifter. This tale stands apart from the others, for it features not some anonymous farmer or traveller, but one of the most famous figures in all of Irish history, Brian Boru, High King of Ireland, the man who united the Irish kingdoms and defeated the Vikings at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. Brian Boru was born around 941, in an era when Ireland was divided into numerous small kingdoms constantly warring with each other and facing regular raids from Norse invaders. Through a combination of military genius, political acumen, and sheer force of will, Brian rose from being a minor prince in Munster to become, by 1002, the undisputed High King of all Ireland, the first man to truly unite the fractious Irish under a single rule. His accomplishments in life were remarkable enough to spawn numerous legends, and it seems fitting that folklore would connect such a figure with the Púca. The legend tells that Brian encountered the Púca during his travels through Ireland, though accounts differ on when exactly this happened. Some versions place this before he became High King, during his years of establishing his power, while others suggest it occurred after he had already claimed the throne. The location most often mentioned is somewhere near the Hill of Tara in County Meath, that ancient sacred site that had served as the seat of Irish high kings for centuries. The exact circumstances of the meeting vary in different tellings, as is common with oral tradition, but the core elements remain consistent across versions. Brian was traveling at night, either alone or with a small group of retainers, when he came upon a magnificent horse standing by the roadside. This was the Púca in its most classic form, a sleek black stallion with a flowing mane and those distinctive glowing golden eyes. Those who accompanied Brian, if anyone did, immediately recognized what this creature was and urged the king to avoid it, to walk past without making eye contact, to do anything except mount that horse. But Brian Boru was not a man accustomed to being frightened, and he certainly wasn't going to be cowed by a fairy creature, no matter how powerful. Against all advice and common sense, Brian approached the Púca horse. In some versions of the tale, he speaks to it, acknowledging what it is and challenging it directly. In others, he simply walks up and mounts it without hesitation, his bravery and confidence so complete that he doesn't feel the need for words. Regardless of the preliminaries, Brian climbed onto the Púca's back, and the wild ride began. The Púca took off at its characteristic impossible speed, racing across the Irish countryside with the High King clinging to its back. But here the story diverges from typical Púca tales. Brian Boru did not scream in terror or beg to be released. He was no drunk stumbling home from a pub, no young fool who'd accepted a dare. He was a warrior who had fought countless battles, a king who had faced down the combined forces of Ireland's enemies, a leader whose physical courage was matched only by his tactical brilliance. According to the legend, Brian had come prepared. Before mounting the Púca, he had crafted a special bridle, and the key to this bridle's power was that it incorporated 3 hairs plucked from the Púca's own tail. How he obtained these hairs, the stories don't specify, leaving this detail to imagination. Perhaps he had gathered them somehow before the encounter, or perhaps this element represents the magical knowledge Brian possessed. Regardless, these 3 hairs, woven into the bridle, gave Brian a measure of control over the supernatural horse. With this magical bridle in place, Brian was able to stay on the Púca's back no matter how wildly it bucked or how fast it ran. According to some accounts, the ride lasted not just hours but days. In these versions, for 4 days and 4 nights, the Púca carried Brian across Ireland, racing from the northern coast to the southern shores, from the eastern mountains to the western cliffs. They galloped across terrain that would kill any normal horse, leaped over obstacles that should have been impossible to clear, forded rivers and scaled peaks in their mad dash across the island. But throughout this epic journey, Brian never lost his seat. His strength, both physical and spiritual, allowed him to endure what would have broken lesser men. And gradually, inevitably, the Púca began to tire. Even supernatural creatures have limits, and the endurance of Brian Boru exceeded those limits. Finally, exhausted, the Púca slowed, stopped, and acknowledged defeat. It had met the one human it could not break, could not frighten, could not throw. In that moment of surrender, Brian extracted promises from the Púca. Different versions of the tale record these promises with slight variations, but the essence remains consistent across tellings. First, Brian made the Púca promise never again to torment Christian people or damage their property. Since by this time Christianity had been well established in Ireland for centuries, this effectively meant that the Púca should leave most of the Irish population alone. Second, and more specifically, Brian specified that the Púca should never attack an Irishman unless that person was drunk or traveling with evil intentions. This provision appears in most versions of the story and is particularly clever, as it essentially made the Púca a kind of supernatural enforcer, targeting those whose behavior invited trouble. The Púca agreed to Brian's terms. It had no choice, really, having been so thoroughly mastered. And then, in most versions of the story, it made a promise of its own, that it would protect Brian and his kingdom, using its powers to warn of dangers and to guard against threats. From that point forward, Brian Boru had the allegiance of one of Ireland's most powerful supernatural beings. This is a remarkable turn in the legend. The Púca, which in so many stories represents chaos and the uncontrollable, submits to human authority and even pledges loyalty. It suggests that even the wildest aspects of nature and the supernatural can be brought into partnership with humanity if approached with sufficient courage and wisdom. It elevates Brian Boru beyond even his historical achievements, marking him as someone who could bridge the gap between the mortal and immortal realms. There's a postscript to the legend that appears in some versions, which helps explain why the Púca continued its mischievous ways in later centuries. According to these tellings, over the years since Brian's time, the Púca has gradually forgotten or chosen to ignore the promises it made. The agreement has worn thin with time, and the Púca has returned to its old ways, once again tormenting all manner of people regardless of whether they are drunk or sober, Christian or otherwise. This element of the folklore serves to reconcile the legend of Brian's mastery with the continued reports of Púca mischief, suggesting that even the most powerful of promises can fade given enough time. The story of Brian Boru and the Púca serves multiple functions in Irish culture. On one level, it's simply a great story, full of adventure and supernatural elements, featuring a beloved historical figure in a legendary context. On another level, it demonstrates the proper way to deal with the Púca, not with fear or avoidance, but with courage tempered by wisdom, with recognition of the creature's power combined with assertion of human agency. It also subtly reinforces moral teachings about the dangers of drunkenness and evil intentions, marking these as worthy of supernatural punishment. But perhaps most importantly, the story provides a kind of wish fulfillment for Irish audiences. In a land that had suffered so much from invasion, conquest, and division, the tale of a high king who could unite not just the human kingdoms but even command the respect and allegiance of the fairy realm must have been deeply appealing. It suggested that through strength and wisdom, humans could establish relationships even with the most dangerous and unpredictable supernatural forces. It offered hope that the wild and chaotic elements of existence, represented by the Púca, might be brought into harmony with human purposes rather than remaining forever in opposition. While the tale of Brian Boru represents the most famous human-Púca interaction, it is far from the only story of Púca displaying helpful or even benevolent behavior. Scattered throughout the rich corpus of Irish folklore are numerous accounts of these shapeshifters acting as protectors, helpers, and even friends to deserving humans. We've already mentioned the tale recorded by Lady Wilde about Padraig and the helpful Púca that ground corn at the mill. This story, as Lady Wilde preserved it from oral tradition, deserves a fuller exploration, as it beautifully illustrates the reciprocal nature of human Púca relationships and the importance of gratitude and respect. Padraig was the son of a poor farmer, and his family owned an old mill that they struggled to operate profitably. The work of grinding grain was exhausting and time-consuming, and Padraig often found himself overwhelmed by the labor required. One evening, as he was walking near the mill, he felt a presence nearby. Being a young man who had been raised on the old stories, he immediately suspected he was in the company of something supernatural. Rather than running away in fear, Padraig spoke aloud, offering his coat to whatever spirit was present. This gesture of generosity without expectation of immediate return is crucial to the story. In response to his offer, the Púca appeared before him in the form of a young bull with sleek black fur and bright, intelligent eyes. It spoke to Padraig in a human voice, telling him to come to the mill that night. Most people, receiving such an invitation from a supernatural creature, would have had the sense to decline. But Padraig, perhaps blessed with either exceptional courage or exceptional foolishness, agreed. That night, he went to the mill and hid himself in a large empty chest where he could watch without being seen. As midnight approached, the Púca arrived, but it didn't come alone. It brought with it a whole crew of supernatural helpers, all taking various animal forms. Together, these creatures set to work at the mill, grinding grain with supernatural speed and efficiency, accomplishing in a few hours what would have taken Padraig days to complete. The bags of flour they produced were of exceptional quality, and by dawn the night's work was complete. This arrangement continued for many weeks. Each night, Padraig would hide in his chest and watch as the Púca and its companions performed the work of the mill. Each morning, he would find more beautifully ground flour ready for market. The family's fortunes improved dramatically. They sold their flour at good prices, gained a reputation for quality, and began to accumulate real wealth. Padraig, grateful for the help and wanting to show his appreciation, used some of his profits to have a fine silk suit tailored. One night, he left this suit at the mill as a gift for the Púca. The creature's reaction to this present is telling. It was absolutely delighted with the fine clothing, so pleased that it declared it must now go out into the world to show off such finery. It thanked Padraig for his kindness and generosity, told him that he and his family had earned enough wealth to live comfortably, and then departed to see more of the world. The nightly milling stopped, but by then Padraig's family had indeed accumulated sufficient resources to retire from their labours. This story reverses many of the usual dynamics of Púca tales. Instead of being tricked or frightened, Padraig receives genuine help. Instead of demanding offerings through fear, the Púca responds to freely given kindness. Instead of an adversarial relationship, there's genuine cooperation and mutual benefit. The story suggests that Pútsoi are not inherently malicious but respond to how they are treated. Show them respect and generosity, and they may repay it many times over. There's also something charming and humanizing about the Púca's delight in the silk suit, its vanity about its appearance, and its desire to go out into the world. These very human emotions and motivations remind us that in Irish folklore, the supernatural beings are not entirely alien but share many traits with humans. They have pride and vanity, they appreciate beautiful things, they value recognition and gratitude. Understanding these motivations provides a key to negotiating with them successfully. Other stories tell of Pútsoi that appeared to warn people of impending danger. In one such account, a man was walking along a cliff path at night when a Púca appeared before him in the form of a large black dog. Rather than attacking or frightening him, the dog blocked his path, refusing to let him pass. The man tried to push past, but the dog held firm, even gently taking the man's coat in its teeth to hold him back. Frustrated and confused, the man stopped and looked more carefully at the path ahead. In the moonlight, he could just make out that a section of the cliff had crumbled away, leaving a gap that he would have walked straight into had the Púca not stopped him. The dog released his coat and disappeared into the shadows, having saved his life without a word of explanation. In another tale that has been passed down, a young woman was traveling through the countryside to visit family when she encountered a well-dressed stranger on the road. He fell into step beside her, and they walked together for some time, chatting pleasantly. But as they approached a particular grove of trees, the stranger suddenly stopped and told her she must go no other way, that the path through the grove was dangerous tonight. When she asked why, he smiled and said only that he was a friend to her family and that she should trust his advice. Then he vanished, and she realized she'd been speaking with a Púca in human form. Taking the creature's advice, she went around the grove by a longer route. The next day, she learned that a group of raiders had been waiting in that grove to ambush travelers, and she would certainly have been attacked had she continued on her original path. These protective interventions often come with little or no explanation. The Púca appears, warns or redirects, and then disappears, leaving the saved human to puzzle out what just happened. The creature rarely seeks gratitude or acknowledgement for these good deeds, suggesting that its motivations are more complex than simple self-interest. Perhaps it has its own code of honor, its own ideas about who deserves protection and who doesn't. Perhaps it's fulfilling some obligation we don't understand, some agreement made long ago or some role assigned to it in the cosmic order. There are also accounts of Pútsoi that formed what can only be described as relationships with particular families or communities. In some regions, certain families had reputations for being under the Púca's protection. Perhaps an ancestor had once done the creature some great service, or perhaps the family had simply shown consistent respect and proper observance of the old traditions. Whatever the reason, these families could count on the Púca's benevolence. Their crops would be blessed, their animals would thrive, and any threats against them would somehow come to nothing. One traditional tale tells of an elderly cobbler who was struggling to make ends meet. His eyesight was failing, his hands weren't as steady as they once were, and customers were taking their business elsewhere. He was facing genuine destitution when he began finding that each morning, the shoes he'd been working on the night before were completed, and completed beautifully. The stitching was perfect, the leather was properly treated, and the craftsmanship was beyond anything he could have done even in his prime. He eventually realized that a Púka was visiting his workshop each night and finishing his work for him. Being a wise man, he left out offerings of milk and bread as thanks, never speaking directly about the arrangement, but making his gratitude clear through his actions. This partnership continued for several years, allowing the cobbler to maintain his reputation and his income despite his failing abilities. When he finally grew too old to work at all, he left one final offering with a note of thanks, and the next morning he found a leather pouch containing enough coins to live comfortably for his remaining years. The Púka never appeared to him again, having fulfilled whatever purpose it had set for itself. But the cobbler lived out his days in comfort and never forgot the kindness of the strange helper who had saved him from poverty. These stories of helpful Pootsai serve as important counterbalances to the tales of terror and mischief. They remind us that folklore is never simple, that the supernatural beings of Irish tradition cannot be easily categorized as good or evil, friend or foe. They suggest that how we approach these powers matters enormously, that respect, generosity, and proper observance of traditions can transform potential adversaries into allies. They also speak to a worldview in which humans and the supernatural are not separate categories but interconnected parts of a larger whole, where relationships can be formed across the boundaries of the natural and supernatural worlds. Of course, for every tale of a helpful Púka, there are many more stories that emphasize its mischievous, frightening, or outright malevolent nature. These darker tales form the bulk of Púka folklore and have been the source of genuine fear in rural Irish communities for centuries. The wild rides we've already described are perhaps the most famous of the Púka's tricks, but they deserve deeper examination. What makes these rides so terrifying is not just the physical danger, though that's certainly present. It's also the complete loss of control, the absolute helplessness of being carried into the night by a supernatural force that seems to delight in your fear. The psychological impact of such an experience would be profound and lasting. Consider what it must have been like from the victim's perspective. You're walking home after an evening at the pub, perhaps a bit unsteady but confident you know the road well. You've traveled it hundreds of times. Then you see a beautiful horse standing by the roadside, seemingly without owner or rider. Maybe you're just drunk enough to think what a stroke of luck this is, or maybe the Púka has ensorcelled you somehow, clouding your judgment. You climb onto its back, expecting to ride comfortably home instead of walking. The moment you settle into place, everything changes. The horse explodes into motion with a speed that drives the breath from your lungs. You grab for its manner, but your hands can't seem to get a firm grip. The landscape blurs past at impossible velocities. The horse takes paths no natural animal would dare, leaping over stone walls, crashing through hedgerows, splashing through icy streams. Branches whip at your face and arms. The cold night air stings your eyes and makes them water. You try to cry out, but the wind tears the sound away. You try to jump off, but you can't seem to let go, can't seem to push yourself away from the creature's back. Hours pass. The ride continues. Your terror gradually shifts from acute panic to a kind of numbed horror. Where is this creature taking you? What does it want? Will you ever see your home or family again? The rational part of your mind tries to insist that this can't be happening, that horses don't move like this, that you must be having some kind of nightmare brought on by drink. But the physical sensations are too vivid, too real to dismiss. The bruises forming on your legs from gripping the horse's sides, the scratches on your face from branches, the aching cold in your fingers, all of it is undeniably real. Finally, as dawn approaches, the ride ends. You find yourself back where you started, deposited by the roadside as if nothing had happened. The Púka is gone, vanished into the morning mist. You're exhausted, battered, confused, and terrified. When you try to tell others what happened, they nod knowingly. You've been taken by the Púka, they say. You're lucky it brought you back at all. And they look at you differently now, as if you've been marked by your encounter with the other world. The psychological aftermath of such an experience would be significant. You might find yourself afraid to travel at night. You might avoid the road where you encountered the Púka, taking longer routes to avoid that particular stretch. You might give up drinking, associating your inebriation with the terrible experience. You might become more religious, seeking protection through prayer and holy symbols. Or you might become obsessed with the encounter, telling and retelling the story, trying to make sense of what happened to you. Beyond the wild rides, the Púka had numerous other tricks in its repertoire. It would appear at night outside people's homes and call their names, trying to lure them outside. Those who had the wisdom to ignore these calls would find that nothing terrible happened, but woe to anyone who answered and went out to see who was calling. They might be taken on a wild ride, or simply led astray into bogs or forests, getting lost for hours or even days. The Púka had a particular talent for mimicking voices, speaking in the tones of friends or family members to deceive the unwary. A young woman might hear her mother's voice calling from outside, only to discover upon going to investigate that her mother was safely asleep in bed and what she heard was a Púka's trick. A farmer might hear his wife calling for help from the barn and rush out to find nothing there but a sense of malevolent amusement hanging in the air. There were also stories of Pootsai that engaged in outright vandalism and destruction. If you had offended the creature in some way, or if you had failed to leave appropriate offerings, or if you had shown disrespect to the old ways and old places, you might wake one morning to find your fences torn down, your tools broken, your stored grain scattered, or your animals released and scattered across the countryside. The Púka was said to be particularly vindictive, never forgetting a slight and taking great pleasure in exacting revenge. Some of the darkest tales portray the Púka as actively malicious and potentially murderous. In these accounts, the creature might lead travelers into bogs where they would sink and drown, or guide them to cliff edges in the dark where one wrong step would mean a fatal fall. It might appear as a friendly guide offering to show someone a shortcut, only to lead them into forests where they would be lost for days, sometimes dying of exposure before finding their way out. These stories are less common than tales of mere mischief, but they add a genuinely sinister edge to the Púka legend, suggesting that under certain circumstances, the creature could be deadly. There's a particularly chilling tradition that the Púka sometimes worked in concert with other dangerous supernatural beings. It might herd travelers toward the hunting grounds of the Dullahan, that headless horseman who appears to claim souls. It might lead people to pools where malevolent water spirits dwelled. It might guide them to fairy forts where they would be taken into the fairy realm and lost to the mortal world forever. In these accounts, the Púka acts almost as a talent scout for death and disaster, identifying suitable victims and delivering them to various terrible fates. The creature's ability to speak made it particularly effective at tormenting people psychologically. There are stories of Pootsai that appeared to travelers in human form and engaged them in conversation, only to gradually reveal intimate knowledge of the person's secrets, shames, and sins. The Púka might tell someone all the ways they had wronged others, all the mistakes they had made, all the disasters that would befall them as consequences of their actions. This kind of psychological torture, coming from a supernatural being that seemed to see into the very depths of one's soul, could be devastatingly effective. In some accounts, the Púka would make false prophecies designed to cause maximum distress. It might tell a prosperous farmer that his crops would fail next year, causing him months of needless worry. It might tell a young woman that her husband-to-be would die before the wedding, casting a shadow over what should have been a joyous time. Sometimes these prophecies would come true, but often they wouldn't, suggesting that the Púka enjoyed the anxiety and fear it created as much as any actual disaster. There's a traditional story, preserved in various forms, about a piper who encountered the Púka late one night. The piper was walking home, more than a little drunk, playing his pipes to keep his spirits up and perhaps to ward off any supernatural presences. But the Púca appeared behind him in horse form and, before the piper could react, tossed him onto its back and began one of its wild rides. The piper, terrified but also somewhat emboldened by drink, kept playing his pipes throughout the ordeal, playing the only tune he really knew well, the Black Rogue. The Púca carried him across the countryside, over hills and through streams, but it seemed to be moving in time with the music. Eventually, after hours of this strange journey, the Púca brought the piper to a gathering of supernatural beings, other Pootsai or perhaps various fairy folk. They made the piper play for them, and he played the Black Rogue over and over because it was all he knew. Finally, at dawn, the Púca returned him to where he had started, and from that day forward, the piper found he could play many more tunes. Whether this was a gift from the Púca or some change wrought by his time in the otherworld, the story doesn't make clear, but the encounter, terrifying as it was, left him with a new and valuable skill. This story is interesting because it blurs the line between terror and transformation, between victimization and initiation. The piper's ordeal was undoubtedly frightening, but it also changed him in a positive way, expanding his musical abilities. It suggests that even the Púca's tricks might serve some larger purpose, that the terror it inflicts might be a kind of initiation, a trial that, if survived, leaves the person stronger or more capable than they were before. Given the Púca's power and its propensity for mischief, it's not surprising that Irish folklore developed numerous methods for protecting oneself against the creature or at least minimizing the damage from an encounter. These protective measures range from the physical to the magical to the behavioral, and they offer fascinating insights into how traditional Irish communities understood and attempted to manage their relationship with supernatural forces. The use of sharp spurs has already been mentioned, but it deserves more detailed examination as it represents one of the few physical defenses against the Púca. The belief was that the creature, despite its supernatural nature, could be controlled or at least deterred by cold iron. Iron has long been considered anathema to fairy beings in Celtic tradition, representing the human world of craft and technology that stands in opposition to the natural, magical realm of the other world. Spurs, being made of iron or steel and being sharp enough to cause pain, embodied this power in a particularly effective form. The story of the young cowherd who used spurs to protect himself from the Púca illustrates this defense perfectly. After being taken on a terrifying ride once, the boy's employer gave him spurs to wear on his boots. When the Púca appeared again, inviting him to mount, the boy agreed, but this time he was prepared. As soon as the creature felt the sharp iron pricking its sides, it bucked and threw the boy off, then galloped away. In subsequent encounters, the Púca would actually ask whether the boy had his sharp things on before approaching, showing a healthy respect for the power of cold iron to wound even a supernatural being. This defense wasn't foolproof, however. It required actually encountering the Púca and mounting it while wearing spurs. If the creature took you by surprise, or if it approached you in some form other than a horse, the spurs would do no good. And there was always the risk that if you used spurs too aggressively, you might enrage the Púca rather than simply deterring it, leading to worse revenge later. Still, for those who had to travel regularly through areas known to be haunted by Pootsai, wearing spurs or carrying iron implements became a common precaution. More broadly, carrying cold iron in any form was considered protective. A small iron nail in your pocket, an iron horseshoe hung over your door, or even the iron tips of your walking stick might provide some measure of safety. This belief reflects a fundamental tension in Irish folklore between the old, natural, magical world represented by the Púca and the newer world of human technology and craftsmanship represented by worked metal. Behavioral protections were equally important. The most fundamental of these was simply avoiding travel at night, especially during the autumn months and particularly around Samhain. If you absolutely had to go out after dark, you should stick to well-traveled roads, avoid lonely places, and never accept invitations from strangers or mysterious animals. Don't mount any horse you find standing by the roadside, no matter how convenient that might seem. Don't follow strange lights or sounds into wild areas. Don't answer if you hear your name called from outside your house at night unless you're absolutely certain you recognize the voice. The tradition of leaving offerings served both as protection and as appeasement. By faithfully leaving the Púca's share of your harvest, by placing food and drink at crossroads or near sacred sites, by maintaining the old observances even in an increasingly Christian Ireland, you demonstrated respect for the supernatural powers and hopefully earned their benevolent regard, or at least their benign neglect. The key was consistency. You couldn't leave offerings only when you wanted something or when you felt particularly worried. It had to be part of the regular rhythm of your life, an acknowledgement that you lived in a world inhabited by beings more powerful than yourself. The practice of placing benches by doorways represents another behavioral approach to managing Púca. By providing a comfortable seat on the right side and making the left side unwelcoming, you encouraged any visiting Púca to sit in the good spot, supposedly influencing it toward more benevolent behavior. This might seem like magical thinking, but it reflects a sophisticated understanding of how small gestures and environmental design can influence behavior, whether dealing with supernatural beings or ordinary humans. Religious protections became increasingly common as Christianity solidified its hold on Ireland. Prayers to saints, especially to Saint Patrick, who was credited with driving many pagan influences from the island, might offer some protection. Carrying holy relics, sprinkling holy water around your property, or making the sign of the cross when you sensed a supernatural presence might help. However, the folklore is somewhat ambiguous about how effective these Christian protections were against the Púca, reflecting the uncomfortable coexistence of Christian and pagan beliefs in Irish culture. Some stories suggest that the Púca respects holy symbols and retreats before them. Others imply that the creature, being from an older, deeper stratum of belief, is largely unaffected by Christian magic. Another form of protection came from simply being a good person. Many accounts specify that the Púca primarily targets those with evil intentions, drunkards, and those who behave badly toward their neighbors or toward the land itself. By living virtuously, showing kindness to others, maintaining your property well, and respecting traditional observances and sacred sites, you supposedly reduced your chances of attracting negative attention from the Púca. This moral dimension to the folklore served an important social function, using the fear of supernatural punishment to reinforce community standards of behavior. There were also protective charms and rituals passed down through families and communities. Certain prayers or rhymes, if recited when you sensed the Púca's presence, might ward it off. Specific plants like rowan or elder, if carried or planted near your home, might offer protection. Salt, that precious commodity that appears in protective rituals across many cultures, might be scattered in patterns around your property to create barriers that the Púca couldn't cross. These practices varied from region to region and family to family, part of a rich tradition of practical magic that people used to navigate a world they understood to be full of unseen dangers. It's worth noting that despite all these protective measures, encounters with the Púca remained common enough in folklore to suggest that perfect protection was impossible. The creature was too clever, too powerful, too fundamentally unpredictable to be completely defended against. The best you could do was reduce your risk and hope that if you did encounter it, you would be treated mercifully. This acceptance of uncertainty, this acknowledgement that some risks simply couldn't be eliminated, reflects a worldview very different from our modern assumption that with enough knowledge and technology we can control all dangers. The Púca's connection to specific places in the Irish landscape adds another rich dimension to the folklore. These aren't vague, unspecific hauntings, but rather traditions tied to particular geographic features that can still be visited today, places where the boundary between myth and reality becomes wonderfully blurred. The term Phouka or Púca pool appears across Ireland, marking bodies of water associated with the creature. These are typically dramatic features, deep pools beneath waterfalls, springs that emerge from underground with remarkable force, or still, dark lakes in mountainous regions. The most famous of these is probably the waterfall on the River Liffey in the Wicklow Mountains, known as Phouka or Phouka, which translates variously as the Púca's pool, or the whole of the Púca. This particular site is geologically dramatic. The Liffey, which will eventually flow through Dublin and empty into the Irish Sea, here rushes through a narrow gorge in the mountains, tumbling over rocks in stages and creating a series of waterfalls. The largest drop creates a deep pool at its base, surrounded by steep rocky walls. The water here is dark and turbulent, constantly churned by the falling water, creating swirling patterns and producing a constant roar that must have seemed deeply uncanny to people in earlier times. It's easy to imagine why this place became associated with the Púca. The power and danger of the water, the way the mist rises from the falls and drifts through the gorge, the shadows and the echoes, all create an atmosphere of otherworldly power. Local folklore claimed that the Púca made its home somewhere in or around this gorge. People would report seeing it, usually at night or in the misty dawn, sometimes as a black horse standing impossibly on the wet rocks, sometimes as other creatures, and sometimes as a vague shadow that seemed to move through the spray. There are accounts of the Púca calling to travelers from the gorge, luring them closer to the dangerous edge. And there are stories of those who fell into the pool, supposedly taken by the Púca, though whether by supernatural agency or simply by the natural dangers of the place is left ambiguous. The River Bann in Northern Ireland has similar associations. As the longest river in the north, flowing through varied terrain from its source to where it empties into the Atlantic, the Bann has multiple Púca pools along its length. Each was traditionally approached with caution, and people would take care not to linger near these waters after dark. The association of the Púca with the sources of major rivers is particularly significant. Rivers were seen as arteries of the land, essential to life and agriculture, and the fact that they emerged from the Púca's territory suggested that even the most fundamental resources humans depended on ultimately came from supernatural realms. In County Fermanagh, the top of Binlaughlin Mountain gained a reputation as a Púca haunt, specifically known as the Peak of the Sneaking Horse. This mountainous terrain, where mist often clings to the slopes and visibility can change in moments, would have been treacherous for travelers. The tradition of the Púca horse that sneaked through these areas likely served as a warning about very real dangers, a way of personifying the risks inherent in mountain travel and encouraging caution. During the Christianization of Ireland, which began in earnest with St. Patrick in the 5th century but continued for several centuries afterward, many of these Púca pools and sacred pagan sites were rededicated to Christian purposes. Púca pools became St. Patrick's wells or were associated with other saints. This process of Christianization attempted to overlay new religious meanings onto older sacred sites, but it was never entirely successful. The people who lived near these places maintained memories of the older names and the older associations. They might sprinkle holy water from a spring now dedicated to St. Patrick, but they would still leave offerings for the Púca and still exercise traditional cautions when near these waters. These geographic anchors for the Púca legend are important because they ground the mythology in physical reality. The Púca isn't just an abstract concept or a story told by firesides. It's tied to real places where real water flows, where real mist rises, where the sounds of wind and water can indeed sound uncanny in the darkness. Anyone can visit Phouka today, can stand at the edge of the gorge and watch the Liffey tumble over the rocks, and can understand immediately why this place inspired stories of supernatural beings. The power of landscape to evoke the numinous, to make people feel the presence of something greater and stranger than themselves, is fundamental to understanding how the Púca legend has survived for so long. Other regions had their own specific Púca haunts. Certain crossroads were known as places where the creature appeared frequently. Particular hills or fields had reputations as Púca territory where it was unwise to linger. Specific ruins, especially of pre-Christian structures, were understood as places where the boundary between worlds was thin and where Púca and other supernatural beings might be encountered. This detailed mapping of supernatural geography created a landscape that was, in a sense, alive with meaning and danger, where every feature had stories attached to it and where the simple act of travel required not just knowledge of roads but also awareness of which places demanded extra caution or respect. The Púca's influence extends far beyond the folk tales told in Irish cottages. This shapeshifter has left its mark on literature, theatre, and popular culture, evolving and adapting while retaining certain core characteristics that have fascinated audiences for centuries. The most famous literary iteration of the Púca is arguably Shakespeare's Puck in A Midsummer Night's Dream, though the connections and distinctions between the Irish Púca and Shakespeare's character have long been debated by scholars. Puck, also known as Robin Goodfellow or Hobgoblin, is the mischievous fairy servant of Oberon who drives much of the plot through his magical interventions and mistakes. Like the Púca, Puck is a shapeshifter with a talent for mischief. Like the Púca, he confuses and frightens mortals, leading them astray in the woods and playing tricks on them. And like the Púca, he occupies a morally ambiguous space, neither wholly good nor wholly evil but rather delighting in chaos for its own sake. However, Shakespeare's Puck is more clearly comic than the Irish Púca. While the Púca can inspire genuine terror and its jokes can have serious consequences, Puck's mischief tends toward the merely embarrassing rather than the dangerous. He turns Bottom's head into an ass's head, but this is played for laughs rather than horror. He causes romantic confusion among the Athenian lovers, but we know from the structure of the comedy that everything will work out well in the end. The wild, dangerous edges of the Púca tradition have been smoothed away to create a character suitable for courtly entertainment. The linguistic connections between Púca and Puck have led some scholars to suggest cultural transmission, with Shakespeare or his sources potentially drawing on Irish and broader Celtic folklore when developing the character. Others argue that Puck represents a separate English tradition that shares common roots with the Irish Púca, but developed independently. The Old English word Púca, meaning goblin, and similar words in other Germanic languages, suggest that belief in these creatures was widespread across northwestern Europe, with each culture developing its own particular interpretation of the shape-shifting trickster spirit. Irish writers have naturally been drawn to the Púca as a subject. Lady Wilde, whose full name was Jane Francesca Agnes Elge Wilde and who married Sir William Wilde, father of Oscar, was a passionate collector of Irish folklore. She published ancient legends, mystic charms, and superstitions of Ireland in the late 19th century, which included several Púca tales. Her work helped preserve stories that might otherwise have been lost as traditional oral culture declined in the face of urbanization and modernization. W.B. Yeats, arguably Ireland's greatest poet and certainly one of the most influential literary figures of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, also took interest in the Púca. In his collection Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry, published in 1888, Yeats included Púca stories and analysis. Interestingly, Yeats chose to depict a Púca as an eagle in one of his poems, drawing on that regional tradition from Waterford and Wexford. Yeats saw in Irish folklore not just quaint stories but a living mythological tradition that could serve as the foundation for a distinctly Irish literary movement, separate from English cultural domination. Sheridan Le Fanu, the Victorian Gothic horror writer who was a contemporary of Bram Stoker and whose work influenced the development of the vampire genre, included Pooka in several of his stories. In one tale, a Pooka appears as a cat, demonstrating that feline form. Lefanu's Pooka tend to be darker and more sinister than those in some other literary treatments, befitting his interest in horror and the uncanny. The 20th century Irish novelist Flann O'Brien, whose real name was Brian O'Nolan, featured a character called Pooka MacPhillamy in his experimental novel At Swim Two Birds. This Pooka is described as a member of the devil class, and is capable of shape-shifting, particularly when smoking a magic pipe. O'Brien's treatment is characteristically postmodern and playful, treating Irish mythology with both respect and irreverence, acknowledging its power while also subjecting it to satirical scrutiny. In modern children's literature, the Pooka has made numerous appearances. Tony D'Italizzi and Holly Black's Spiderwick Chronicles includes a Phouka character, specifically as a cat. These books, which blend various folkloric traditions, introduce young readers to the idea of shape-shifting spirits and the concept that supernatural beings aren't simply good or evil but complex personalities with their own motivations. The Pooka has also appeared in film, though often in ways that stray from the original Irish folklore. The 1950 film Harvey, starring James Stewart, features a 6-foot-tall invisible rabbit called Harvey who only the main character can see. While the film's script identifies Harvey as a Pooka, drawing on the Irish term, the creature bears little resemblance to the Irish original beyond being associated with an animal form and possessing a somewhat mischievous nature. The film plays the concept for whimsical comedy rather than drawing on the darker, more ambiguous aspects of the Pooka tradition. More faithful to Irish tradition is the 1959 Disney film Darby O'Gill and the Little People, which includes a Pooka scene. When the main character falls down a well and enters the realm of the leprechauns, the Pooka appears as a black horse with glowing eyes, much closer to traditional Irish depictions. The film, while certainly taking liberties with Irish folklore for entertainment purposes, at least attempts to capture something of the authentic atmosphere and character of these legends. In recent years, Ireland has celebrated its Pooka heritage in a more direct way through the Pooka Festival, held annually in County Meath in the towns of Trim and Athboy. This festival, developed by Failt Ireland, the Irish Tourism Board, in partnership with local councils, celebrates Ireland as the birthplace of Halloween and showcases Irish folklore, music, and culture. The festival includes storytelling sessions about the Pooka and other Irish supernatural beings, music and dance performances, fire ceremonies referencing ancient Samhain traditions, and costume processions where people dress as various creatures from Irish mythology. The Pooka festival represents an interesting development in how folklore functions in the modern world. Rather than being a purely organic tradition passed down through generations, it's a consciously constructed cultural event designed to celebrate and preserve folklore while also attracting tourism. Some might argue that this commercialization of folklore dilutes its authentic power. Others would counter that adapting folklore to new contexts and new purposes has always been part of how these traditions survive. The Pooka has always been a shapeshifter. Perhaps its transformation from genuine belief to cultural celebration is simply another shape it has assumed in its long existence. The enduring appeal of the Pooka in literature and popular culture speaks to something fundamental in its character. As a shapeshifter, the Pooka can be adapted to different contexts while retaining its essential nature. As a morally ambiguous figure, it offers more complexity than simple monsters or benevolent fairies. As a creature tied to specific places and traditions, it provides a connection to Irish culture and landscape. And as a being that exists between the human and supernatural worlds, it embodies our fascination with the boundaries we cannot cross and our desire to peek beyond the veil that separates ordinary existence from the magical. As we come to the end of our journey through Pooka folklore, it's worth reflecting on what this creature represents and why its legend has endured for over a millennium, surviving the transition from pagan to Christian Ireland weathering centuries of English occupation and cultural suppression, and persisting into our modern, supposedly rational age. The Púca embodies several fundamental truths about existence that remain relevant regardless of whether we literally believe in shape-shifting spirits. First, it represents the wildness and unpredictability of the natural world. Despite all our technology and knowledge, nature remains ultimately beyond our complete control. Weather, illness, accidents, all the chances and changes of life continue to surprise us, to disrupt our plans, to remind us that we are not as much in charge as we like to believe. The Púca's unpredictability, its refusal to be simply good or evil, mirrors this fundamental quality of existence itself. Second, the Púca embodies the liminal, those threshold spaces and times when ordinary rules don't quite apply. Dusk and dawn, the changing of seasons, crossroads and boundaries, these are the Púca's domains. In a deeper sense, all of life exists in liminal space, constantly transitioning from one state to another, never quite fixed or stable. The Púca reminds us to be alert during these transitions, to recognize that moments of change are also moments of both danger and opportunity. Third, the folklore surrounding the Púca teaches lessons about respect for tradition, for the land, and for powers beyond ourselves. The importance of leaving offerings, of observing proper festivals, of treating sacred sites with reverence, all of this speaks to a worldview in which humans exist in relationship with forces larger than themselves. In our modern age of individualism and technological mastery, there's something valuable in being reminded that we are part of larger systems, that we owe debts to the past and the land, that arrogance and disrespect have consequences. Fourth, the Púca stories function as moral instruction wrapped in entertainment. The creature often targets drunkards, those with evil intentions, those who are careless or disrespectful. While we might not believe in literal supernatural punishment, the underlying message remains valid. Your behavior has consequences, and the universe has ways of teaching lessons to those who need them. The Púca serves as a personification of karma, of the principle that what goes around comes around. Fifth, there's the simple power of mystery and wonder. The Púca legends keep alive a sense that the world is stranger and more mysterious than it appears, that explanations and rationality don't account for everything. In an age of scientific materialism, where mystery is steadily banished by research and analysis, the Púca offers a counter-narrative. Some things, these stories whisper, cannot be fully explained. Some encounters remain mysterious. The world retains a capacity to surprise and confound us. The regional variations in Púca belief also speak to how folklore functions as cultural memory and local identity. Each area of Ireland shaped the legend to reflect its own concerns and landscape. The Púca became a vessel for local knowledge, local fears, local values. In the stories about what forms the Púca takes, where it appears, what it does, communities encoded important information about dangerous places, proper behavior, seasonal timing for agricultural work, and much more. The folklore wasn't just entertainment or superstition. It was a technology for transmitting vital cultural knowledge across generations. The persistence of Púca beliefs, even among people who don't literally believe in supernatural beings, is fascinating. Many Irish people today will still, perhaps half-jokingly, leave a portion of their garden harvest untouched, acknowledging it as the Púca's share. They'll repeat old warnings about not eating blackberries after November. They'll tell Púca stories to their children, not necessarily because they believe them in a literal sense, but because these stories are part of their heritage, part of what it means to be Irish. The folklore has become cultural memory rather than genuine belief, but in some ways this makes it more rather than less powerful. The Púca also speaks to the Irish experience of colonization and cultural survival. Throughout centuries of English rule, when Irish language and culture were systematically suppressed, folklore became a form of resistance. The stories told by firesides, the beliefs passed down from parent to child, the old names for places and the old observances of festivals, all of this represented an Irish identity that persisted despite political domination. In this context, the Púca, that creature that could never be fully controlled or conquered, that kept returning in new forms, that demanded respect on its own terms, could be seen as embodying something of Irish cultural resilience. For modern audiences, whether Irish or not, the Púca offers something increasingly rare, a genuine sense of connection to pre-modern ways of understanding the world. Before the scientific revolution, before the Enlightenment, before the modern assumption that the universe is fundamentally mechanistic and comprehensible, people experienced the world as alive with spirits and powers, as fundamentally mysterious and not entirely safe. The Púca, with its ancient roots stretching back over 1,000 years, gives us a window into that older worldview. It allows us to imagine what it was like to live in a world where the night was genuinely dark, where the forest was truly wild, where the boundary between the ordinary and the supernatural seemed permeable. So what do we make of the Púca in our modern age? We don't literally believe that black horses with glowing eyes will take us on midnight rides. We don't think that spit on blackberries comes from supernatural beings. We have rational explanations for strange sounds at night, for optical illusions in the mist, for all the phenomena that once fed belief in shape-shifting spirits. And yet, the Púca persists, not as belief but as story, not as fact but as metaphor, not as superstition but as culture. Perhaps that's the ultimate trick this master shapeshifter has pulled, transforming itself from an object of genuine fear and reverence into a cultural symbol, a literary figure, a festival mascot, an element of Irish identity. The Púca has survived precisely by changing form, by adapting to new contexts while retaining something essential of its original character. In a world that has less and less space for genuine mystery, the Púca creates a small pocket where wonder can still dwell. In a culture increasingly disconnected from landscape and tradition, the Púca offers a thread connecting us back to older ways of being in the world. And so the Púca continues its journey through Irish consciousness, neither entirely forgotten nor entirely believed, neither wholly tame nor wholly wild, existing in that liminal space between then and now, between real and imagined, between the world as it is and the world as it might be. Late at night, on a lonely road in the Irish countryside, when mist swirls across the asphalt and the modern world seems to fade into something older and stranger, who's to say what you might encounter? Who's to say that a black horse standing beside the road is merely a black horse? Who's to say that the stranger who greets you by name is merely a stranger? The Púca endures because it speaks to something deeper than rational belief or disbelief. It speaks to our awareness that life is ultimately mysterious, that control is an illusion, that wildness persists beneath the surface of civilization, and that the world is far stranger and more wonderful than our everyday experience suggests. As long as humans tell stories around fires or share tales in darkened rooms, as long as we seek to understand our relationship with nature and with forces beyond ourselves, the Púca will continue to gallop through our collective imagination, shape-shifting but recognizable, terrifying but strangely appealing, forever reminding us that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophies. And now, my dear friends, as our journey through Púca folklore comes to an end, I hope you found something in these ancient stories that speaks to you, whether it's the thrill of a good tale, the wisdom embedded in traditional beliefs, or simply a renewed sense of mystery and wonder. If you've enjoyed this exploration of Irish mythology, I hope you'll join me again soon as we delve into other corners of Celtic folklore and continue our wanderings through the mist-shrouded landscapes of legend. If you enjoyed this journey through the shape-shifting world of the Púca, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep these ancient stories alive, and allows us to continue exploring the rich mythology of Ireland together. Perhaps leave a comment sharing whether you've heard any Púca stories from your own family, or if you've visited any of the places in Ireland associated with this magnificent shapeshifter. Until we meet again, may your paths be safe from mischievous spirits, may your harvests be abundant, and may you always remember to leave a little something for the powers that dwell in the wild places. Sweet dreams, dear travelers, and beware of beautiful black horses standing by lonely roads in the gathering dusk.